Back, time for 10.2. As we go through 10.2, we're going to look at how the West is transformed during this period of time. We're going to see how the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad is really going to link together the East and the West. We're going to see the impact of mining and railroads on the settlement out West. We'll see the impact of physical and human geographic factors on the settlements of the Great Plains. We'll discuss the ways various groups use the land in the West, the conflicts among them. We'll analyze the treatment of Chinese immigrants and Mexican Americans in the West. As we go through this, make sure you double check your answers. Make sure you have down a similar response. Feel free to add to your responses as need be. But you need not rewrite an answer or delete your answer if it's something similar. You don't need my answers word for word. All right, question 1. How was the West swept by enormous change after the Civil War? Well, as railroads increased access, settlers, ranchers, and miners permanently transformed millions of acres of Western land. Mining was the first great boom in the West. Gold and silver were magnets that attracted a vast number of people out West. In fact, during this period of time, many boom towns came up out of nowhere. Boom towns were previously sparsely or not even populated at all areas that almost overnight saw a huge population explosion, usually after the discovery of gold or silver. However, once those precious minerals disappeared, people quickly vacated the area, turning those areas into ghost towns. 3. Mining stimulated the development of new towns, some of which became well established. Identify the key steps in this process. First, the miners would discover the valuable resource, set up camps. These would just be very basic camps, tents, and things like that. This led other people to move into the area in order to make money by selling supplies to the miners. This includes food, drinks, clothing, lodging, etc. As the population grew, so too did the need for order. That's how vigilantes developed. Vigilantes were people who kind of took the law into their own hands. People set rules of conduct and procedures for settling disputes. Sometimes they would have duels. Often people who committed crimes would be hanged for their crimes. Eventually, they would hire sheriffs and deputies and things like that to provide more a permanent system of law enforcement. As order was established, townspeople began to desire the establishment of community institutions, churches, and schools, and more organized system like that. When you think about some of the early mining out there, and remember, a mine is a terrible thing to waste. When you look at mining out in the West, placer mining was very simple mining. Western mining was done by individuals who extracted the minerals from the surface soil or a stream bed. Sometimes it's simply like panning, as you can see the gentleman here. He's got his best friend with him too, his dog. So they just basically took that and they went through and kind of sift out and hope to find some gold nuggets. How did mining change by the 1870s? By the 1870s, the remaining mineral wealth was located deep underground. So they basically had panned all the surface-related minerals. Big companies with big dollars or big money would come in. They would buy the heavy equipment it took to get to the gold and the silver that might be a little bit further down below. Machines drilled deep mine shaft, tracks lined miles of underground tunnels. Crews often recruited Mexican immigrants and Chinese immigrants into the country to work in these dangerous conditions underground. So basically, the gentleman pictured above, eventually he would no longer be able to be profitable, as he would no longer be able to find the gold along the stream or the bed line, and that he would not have the resources or money to invest in the heavy equipment and technology needed to go deep down into the tunnels. What is the Transcontinental Railroad and why was it built? Transcontinental Railroad is a rail link between the East and the West, and basically what you had was a situation that there was a Eastern line that began to move west and a Western line that began to move east, and eventually they connected. They connected in Utah, and you can see here is where the two lines met, shaking hands, and this is signifying the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Next, we'll look at what was beneficial about the Transcontinental Railroad. Some of the obvious things would be the ability to transport goods from one part of the country more quickly and easily than in the past. This helped to spark economic growth. The ability for people to move from one part of the country to another more quickly and easily than in the past, thereby spurring the growth of new communities out west. Congress encouraged construction of the Transcontinental Railroad through first funding by providing money in the form of loans to railroad companies, made land grants, which gave them cheap or free land to build the railroads on. Simultaneously, or at the same time in 1863, two railroad companies, as I alluded to before, began to construct the Transcontinental Railroad. The Central Pacific started laying tracks eastward from Sacramento, the westernmost point of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific took the furthest eastern point to the Eastern Railroad and made it all the way to Nebraska and began to move from Nebraska, constructing the railroad westward. There are many challenges in regard to the construction of the railroad. The human cost of building the railroad was high. Starved for labor, the Central Pacific Company brought in recruits from China and set them to work under harsh conditions with little regard for their safety. Working for the Union Pacific, crews of Irish immigrants crossed the level plains from the east. The two tracks eventually met in Utah in 1869, and the last spike that was hammered in was made out of gold to signify the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Remember, if at any point in time I'm going too quickly, you can always pause the video clip if you need to double check any of your answers. 11. How did the cattle industry impact Western settlement? Cattle ranching fueled another Western boom. This was sparked by the vast acres of grass that was suitable for feeding herds of cattle. Once the railroad provided the means to move livestock to eastern markets, a race was on for land and water. Explain how the open range system worked in the southwestern United States. Well, the Texas Longhorn, which originated in Mexico, roamed freely and foraged for its own feed along the grasslands. In order to figure out who owned which cattle, owners would mark or brand their cattle with a branding iron so the cattle could be more easily identified. They would have a ranch symbol that symbolized that cattle belonged to, let's say, the Clark Ranch in southwestern Texas. Under the open range system, property was not fenced in. Though ranchers claimed ownership and knew the boundaries of their property, cattle from any ranch grazed freely along those boundaries. When spring came, the ranchers would hire cowboys to comb thousands of acres of open range, rounding up cattle that had roamed all winter long. Here you can see in this photograph the cattle in the background and the cowboys here. When you think about the culture of the cowboy and the roots of the cowboy, it should be traced back to the very existence of cowboys to the Mexican vaqueros who had learned to train horses to work with cattle and had developed the roping skills, saddle, and the chaps needed to do the job. Cowboys rounded up the cattle and began the long cattle drive to take the animals to a railroad that then would transport them to eastern markets to be slaughtered. There's a Mexican vaquero right there. You can notice a little different style of hat that the Mexican vaquero had that was a little bit different than the style of a traditional cowboy hat. Was the life of a cowboy easy? Hardly. Cowboys worked hard, dangerous, low-paying, and lonely jobs, often involving many months of chasing cattle over hundreds or thousands of miles of countryside. The band of cowboys included a mix of whites, Mexicans, and African Americans. Why did the open range system eventually disappear? Well, the invention of barbed wire made it possible to then fence in huge tracts of land on treeless plains. The supply of beef exceeded the demand, and the price of beef dropped sharply. Added to these factors was a period of extreme weather in the 1880s, very cold winters followed by summer droughts. As springs dried up, herds of cattle starved. The nature of cattle ranching changed as ranchers began to raise hay to feed their stock, and farmers and sheep herders settled on what had been open range. You can see here a cowboy kind of leading a organized row of cattle back to their home ranch or to the train station to be transported to the slaughterhouses on the East Coast. Farmers settled the plains. Who were the squatters? Throughout history, the nation's westward expansion had been marked by migrants settling on public land they did not own. These settlers became known as squatters. They basically physically took possession of land they didn't own and then pressured the government to allow them to gain ownership of this land. In 1841, Congress passed the Preemption Act. It afforded squatters the right to buy up to 160 acres of land for $1.25 per acre. Pretty cheap. So basically for $200, you could buy 160 acres of land, which would probably today have the value of many, many millions of dollars. The Homestead Act in 1862 promoted westward settlement. Under the Homestead Act, the government offered a similar amount of land, 160 acres, to anyone who was willing to live on the land for 5 years, dig a well, and build a road. So basically, they wanted to encourage settlement. You can even see here on the poster here, millions of acres available. These two laws encouraged further settlement and farming in the West, eventually leading to a closed frontier, meaning that all land was eventually settled on. Who were the Exodusters? A group of African Americans called Exodusters took their name from the biblical story of Moses, leading the exodus of Jews out of bondage into a new life in the Promised Land. The Exodusters' Promised Land was in Kansas and Oklahoma, where they planted crops, and they founded several enduring all African American towns. Cite evidence that the Chinese immigrants and Mexican Americans were discriminated against in the West. How did these groups respond to discrimination? Evidence of discrimination against Chinese Americans included California's barring cities from giving jobs to people of Chinese ancestry, and Congress's passage of the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which banned Chinese workers from even entering the country. Evidence of discrimination against Mexican Americans includes the fact that 4 out of 5 Mexican Americans who lived in New Mexico lost their land after the Mexican-American War, even though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had guaranteed their property rights. Both groups challenged the discrimination that they experienced. Chinese Americans filed lawsuits in court, but with only mixed results. Mexican Americans formed groups such as Las Corrales Blancas, which retaliated against the loss of property by cutting holes in the barbed wire fences of large ranches, and the Alonzo Hispano-Americana, which worked to protect Mexican American interest in legal rights. What central idea is conveyed about minorities and the parts they played in settling the American West? Despite discrimination they often suffered, minorities played essential roles in settling the western frontier. For example, Mexican Americans helped begin the tradition of cattle ranching in Texas, while African American exodusters established farms and towns in the plains. The Chinese immigrants, they helped to build the American railroad system. Struggles continued out west. What caused tension between miners, farmers, ranchers, and shepherd herders in the West? Tension arose when the groups needed to share limited resources and one group damaged another's supply. For example, Mining required the use of water to extract minerals, and during the extraction process, the water became contaminated. Water was often in short supply, and contamination made the shortage worse for other groups who needed water. Also, in some areas, shepherd herders or sheep herders and ranchers needed the same grasslands for their animals to graze on. The sheep gnawed the grass so close to the ground the cattle could not graze in the same land afterwards. There are many cultural differences between Mexicans and Americans, and the El Paso Salt War would illustrate this. The fundamental difference in the point of view of land and land ownership. Mexicans consider the salt beds communal property, open to all because many generations of people had mined salt from the beds without claiming exclusive rights to salt or to the land. In contrast, when Americans arrived in the 1870s, they viewed the salt beds the same as they viewed other land in the West, as valuable property to be owned and claimed. The fundamental difference caused conflict between Mexicans and Americans. Cite evidence from the text. By 1890, the United States no longer had a western frontier. By 1890, the word frontier was used to refer to uninhabited wilderness where no one lived, mainly whites. The 1890 census shows there was no longer a square mile of the United States that did not have at least a few white residents. Therefore, it was argued that by 1890, the western frontier was gone. In the aftermath of Western expansion, what were some of the challenges that we faced? We had to face the challenge of providing security and safety in the new lands, services to the new lands, schools, and access to transportation and such. And then, of course, Native Americans were always in conflict in the idea that whites were now on their land. Hopefully you enjoyed 10.2. Until next time, Mr. Clark is out.